Hey, Dr. Gleb, I'm really glad to have you on the show. Where are you calling in from today?
Calling in from Columbus, Ohio. Go Bucks.
Nice, go Bucks. um, so, uh, I've just finished reading your book, Never Go With Your Gut, and I thought it was really interesting and relevant to both, the times we're going through right now with the coronavirus, as well as a lot of the discussion that was happening in the staffing and recruiting industry around unconscious bias and how that can negatively impact decision making. But how did your background and experience lead to creating the approach that you've written about to decision making in your book?
Well, my background approach all came actually from my childhood. When I was a kid, my parents, like pretty much everybody else, follows the common advice of going with your gut, following your intuitions, going with your heart, whatever, name your poison. Unfortunately, their guts often disagreed with each other. So, for example, my mom, she liked to buy nice clothing, so she'd go out and she'd buy a $100 sweater. And she'd come back home, and my dad was kind of a cheapskate, so he'd yell at her, say, no sweaters should be worth over $20, and then they'd go at it, bringing up past griefs and having lots of conflicts. Not good. Already as a kid, I could see that that didn't really change either person's mind, didn't change their behavior, but they still went at it all the time. Now, the worst time was when my dad, so he was a real estate agent, and he worked based on commission, so he had a variable income. There was about a 6-month period where he made a lot of money, but he hid it from my mom, told her he made very little money. And he actually bought an apartment on the side, probably he hid it from her because he didn't want her buying more sweaters. Anyway, she found out in a couple of years, and it was just such a big, big conflict, such a huge, big blowout fight. It was really terrible. She kicked him out of the house. He had to live in that house he bought, or at least out to other people in that apartment. And I lived without my dad for a long time until they eventually reconciled, but you could never really trust him again. So having had that experience, both the small fights and that huge fight, really made me wonder, why do we make our decisions the way we do? Why did nobody sit me down and tell me, hey, kiddo, here's how you make your decisions? I didn't get that in high school. I didn't get that in college. So I decided to study this myself. And as I was growing up, I saw people around me making all sorts of terrible decisions. Now, I came of age around the dime of the dot-com boom, when, 1999, I was 18 in 1999, when tech leaders were partying like it's 1999, for those who remember that old Prince song. Well, in just a couple of years later, everything went bust. And I was 21, 2001, 2002, went bust. So that was really terrible for a lot of people who lost their life savings. And that was, the tech leaders who were praised as the heroes in the Wall Street Journal in 1999 were just, there as the villains in 2002. And even worse, of course, were the Enrons of the world who hid their losses from the dot-com bust using fraudulent accounting. So that caused even more people to lose their money for maliciously bad decision making. Tech leaders and investors, it was stupid decision making that they made, but the Enron leaders, Bernie and whatever Ebers and so on, made really bad decisions that were maliciously bad. So I decided to study this topic, and I learned about what caused people like that to make bad decisions, as well as my parents. And I became a consultant, coach, trainer, speaker for leaders at all levels to address these sorts of bad decision-making patterns, risk management issues. I've been doing that for the last 20 years. Now, as I was studying this stuff, I realized that the popular literature out there is very sparse, and the good stuff was very, very especially sparse. So I had to go into academia, and I became a cognitive neuroscientist, behavioral economist. I've been researching these topics for 15 years in academia, including for 7 years as a professor at Ohio State. That's how I'm here in Columbus. And that I combined all of that, my research, cutting edge research in cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics, together with the 20 years of experience consulting, coaching, and training into the new book that you mentioned, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. That's my background. That's how I came to be where I am right now.
Nice, that's incredible. And right now we're in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. And what are some of the making errors you're seeing business leaders and everyday people making in the midst of this?
What I'm seeing is a lot of people are following the old gut reaction, fight or flight response. And that is our response to threats just because of how our brains are wired. We are wired not for the modern environment. That's not what we're evolutionarily adapted to. We're adapted to the savannah environment, when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, were hunters and gatherers. And we had to have a very strong fight or flight response because we had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. Well, in the modern world, there are many less saber-toothed tigers, but we respond to threats, so there are saber-toothed tigers. So we respond to the pandemic as though it's in the moment crisis, immediate. We jump into emergency mode, and we think that by doing that, taking care, having our employees work at home or whatever, doing super fast, quick research on the vaccines will get us to the vaccine magically in a couple of weeks, a few weeks. So people are really not prepared for understanding what is the long-term impact of this pandemic. We don't think well about the long term. We don't think well about slow-moving train wrecks, because in the savanna environment, we didn't have to. We didn't really face slow-moving train wrecks in that context. That was not important for us. So we're not evolved to address these topics. So we fall into three specific errors. And the errors that we fall into because of how our brain is wired, cognitive neuroscientists and behavioral economists like myself call them cognitive biases. So there are three cognitive biases that are specifically problematic for the COVID-19 pandemic. Those are, first, the normalcy bias. Now, normalcy bias refers to us just feeling that the future will be similar to today. That's what it feels like. Now, we might logically know that's not true, but that's what it feels like. So it feels like the pandemic will be over in a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, and we'll go back to January 2020. We will not. It's never going to be the same because of the actual reality of the pandemic. The pandemic is incredibly infectious, so it has infection rate of every person gets infected, on average infects 2 to 4 others. And the infection rate doubles every 3 to 6 days. And this is really bad. It has a fatality rate for people over 50 of around 5%. That's what we know right now. It might be a little bit less, a little bit more, but that's kind of what we know right now. And of course, the older you are, the worse it is. So this is a very dangerous situation. And our hospital system, as Italy's is, might well become overwhelmed if we don't control it. And right now, I'm seeing a lot of political leaders not taking the steps needed to control the pandemic. So people don't realize that the vaccine, it will take us about 18 months in the most optimistic scenario to create an effective vaccine against the pandemic. And then, of course, it'll take another year or more to produce enough of it to vaccinate people, sufficient amounts of people, and then to actually distribute it and vaccinate people. And then we'll have to deal with the anti-vaxxers too, right? So this will be a big problem. The pandemic will still be around for the next 3 years, maybe, in the optimistic scenario. Pessimistically, we will not find a vaccine for the pandemic that's better than the flu vaccine. Flu vaccine is only 50% effective in reducing the flu rate, so not that effective. So we might be stuck with COVID-19 for the rest of our lives. It won't be a pandemic, it will just be a fact of life. And we have to figure out how to cope. So for that world, people are not prepared. Businesses are not prepared. Leaders are not prepared. Professionals aren't prepared. So normalcy bias really hobbles them in envisioning a future that's radically different from today. That's one. Second, cognitive bias related to that is planning fallacy. So we tend to think that our plans will come true. We are very optimistic about our plans, and we don't plan in nearly enough resources for contingencies, risks, problems. COVID-19, huge problem. It was very foreseeable that there might be a major risk, whether something like a global pandemic, very realistic, or consequences of climate change or stuff like that. The fires in Australia, right? Pretty bad. California, pretty bad. So we can foresee that there are major threats that we don't anticipate, but that can happen. And people don't realize and plan for the potential possibility of these threats. That's planning fallacy. And finally, we tend to be very short-term oriented because of that savanna response. So dealing with threats, we tend to think about the short term, not about the long term. When I say 3 years as an optimistic scenario, I always get pushback. People say, can't be 3 years. Well, this is not possible. We'll be finished with it. It'll burn out by the summer. That's very, very unrealistic. Neither the CDC nor the WHO thinks we'll burn out by the summer. People don't realize the kind of long-term impact they have to deal with, and they don't think about the long term. So businesses really need to change their business model fundamentally to deliver their services virtually, if they're not already, which most aren't, and they need to change their internal structure, their internal organization for internal collaboration in virtual settings from their internal teams, and they're not prepared to do that. And of course, individuals have to do the same things. So these are the things that people aren't thinking about in terms of the long term.
And then you mentioned one more form of bias as well, right? Because you said normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and
Yes,
then
the
was there?
hyperbolic discounting, right. So thank you for highlighting that. So looking toward the short term, undercounting the long term is called hyperbolic discounting. So we undercount, excessively undercount the long term. That's what it's about.
That's fascinating. I've never heard about that one before. Did you say it was called hyperbolic? Say it again.
Hyperbolic discounting. So we discount the long term. We're excessively oriented toward the short term, and especially bad when we're dealing with slow-moving train wrecks like the coronavirus pandemic.
Wow. So why is it so important to never go with your gut in business decisions?
Well, our gut is not adapted for the modern environment, and that means that in business decisions, we're very tempted to go with our gut. Now, leaders are praised for quick decision making. Quick decision making is a fight or flight response decision making. That's what it comes from. So quick decision making are rooted in the gut, and fight or flight are often going to be bad responses. Now, think about this: when you're getting a constructive, critical email from your client, let's say that's the scenario. One tempting route is to ignore it, delete it, ignore, never happened. That's the flight response. Now, another tempting thing to do is to write back and say, no, you're absolutely wrong. I'm right. You're a jerk. That's the fight response. Neither of those responses is the right response. And the right response is very counterintuitive. It goes very much against our intuitions, because the right thing to do is to stop, calm down, process our emotions around the constructive criticism, that nasty email, and then figure out what actually made the client irate, what made the client angry. Look at the systems, the processes that you have going on in your company that caused the client to have that negative experience, and address whatever the systematic causes are, and then figure out how to specifically address the email, or in combination, figure out how to specifically address the email, tell the client, hey, I screwed up. This is why it happened. Here's what we're going to do to fix it. So this is the right response. This is the best response for that situation. But of course, it's not going to work out very well if you don't have the right, if you don't have the right mindset, if you're just going with your gut. Now, whether your client is a company that has hired you to do a recruitment process, or your client is someone who has hired you to help them headhunt, you have to do the same thing in either case because they're your client. But we are very tempted to not do the right thing. And this is just one example out of many where we don't make good decisions. I mean, hiring decisions, we can talk about that for ages. The kind of bad decision making we make because of our gut reaction. Now, talked about the fight or flight response. Another fundamental aspect of the savannah environment is tribalism. So we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. And tribalism means that you have to be very strongly oriented toward people who look like you, who think like you, have your values. Because in the savannah environment, if you weren't strongly tribal, you wouldn't survive in that environment. If the tribe kicked you out, you would die. And if you weren't sufficiently supportive of the tribe and other people were died or it fell apart, you would die too. So we are the descendants of those people who had a very strong tribal response. That means that in the modern environment, we very much have that strong tribal response of looking for people who are like us when we hire and when we make these evaluations, hiring and promotion, and ignoring people or discounting people, thinking that they're not worth as good as they are if they don't look like they're from our tribe, if we don't perceive them as part of our tribe. And this is a huge problem in recruiting.
Absolutely. And I think one of the really interesting examples you talked about in your book was you called out the disastrous decisions that were made around the Boeing 737 MAX. It'd be great if you could just maybe mention a bit about that.
Mm-hmm. The Boeing 737 MAX was a classic example of a couple of problems. One of the biggest problems here is called the confirmation bias. Now, what's happening with what is the confirmation bias? It causes us to tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. So the Boeing leadership was looking for information that the 737 MAX during the production schedule was doing well, doing fine. And what it found was information that all of its previous new planes, new models of its airplane were very good. They were safer than the past. So if you look at the history of Boeing models, new models, you will see that over the past few decades, the Boeing models were actually better. Each one was safer. So they had trouble imagining, again, going back to the normalcy bias, they had trouble imagining that the future would be different than the past. So confirmation bias, normalcy bias. And they released, and despite a lot of signals from inside the company, from safety engineers, from pilots, engineers, and so on, who were saying things like the 737 MAX is a plane designed by monkeys, ruled by clowns. This is not the thing that you actually want to hear. But the leadership completely ignored this, and it went forward. Well, we know what happened. 346 people killed, and even before the epidemic, Boeing took a write-down of around 20 billion, and of course you'll have many more reputational consequences for many. Can you imagine the number of 20 billion? It's a huge number, but Boeing has just lost that amount of money even before the fall of stocks due to the pandemic. So this was a big problem for Boeing, and Boeing didn't handle it very well at all.
But so it seems like every time business leaders go with their gut, something disastrous or negative happens. But are there any times in business decisions where it's actually a good idea to go with your gut?
Well, the only time in business decisions, so just to be clear, in everyday life decisions, when you're in a life or death situation, when you have someone with COVID-19 about to sneeze on you, you probably want to go with your gut and cover your face or duck or something like that. Now, in a business situation, that really is not going to be the kind of business decision we're talking about. Business decisions, you almost always have a few minutes to think things through. And a few minutes should be enough to address the vast majority of the kind of problems that you have to deal with. However, there are some times when your gut should be more trusted. And here, the kind of examples where your gut should be trusted is situations where you have frequently made the right decision in the past based on immediate feedback. So for example, when you are dealing with profit and loss statements, so if you've looked at a whole bunch of profit and loss statements, you can probably take a quick glance at it and decide whether the business unit is doing well or not and what should be done. What happened there? Well, it's not actually your gut. We think of it as our gut response, as automatic response. But what happened there is a learned habit. So it's a learned habit where you learned over time by looking at a number of profit and loss statements what to look for. So you automatically scan for that. It's become a habitual pattern. So you've changed your habit from the gut response, which you had to learn, to this new pattern, which is trustworthy. So this is where it feels like you're going with your gut, but you actually aren't. You're going with a new civilized habit. So civilized habits are the ones you develop that are adaptive to the modern environment. Now, there are some situations where your intuitive gut responses will be the right one. And this is the pattern that resembles what's happened in the savannah environment. So inside the tribe, there was a lot of politicking when in those small tribes of 15 people to 150 people who would get the leadership, would control resources. So you have to learn to read your tribal members and their patterns, their signals, their social cues. So if you're in a relationship with someone and you know that person for a long time, you're confident about your ability to read their social cues, that's the time to more or less trust your gut if your gut is telling you something is off. Now, question this new business deal they're proposing if your gut tells you something is off. Question whether they're bringing you the right information, if they might have motivations that are problematic for you. So those are the times to rely on your gut more.
Okay. So, I mean, there definitely seems to be some use cases in business for relying on your gut. But what I see a lot of, especially on websites like Forbes, and there's even been a TED Talk around, I think the title of the TED Talk was Go With Your Gut. And so if trusting your intuition in business is such a bad idea, why are there so many business gurus that are encouraging this approach?
Well, unfortunately, those business gurus are telling you to do what's comfortable for you. And that's the definition of going with your gut. You do what's comfortable for you. And people are paid good money for telling you to do what's comfortable for you. Now, think about this. If somebody tells you, go and eat a dozen donuts. Dozen donuts are great. That's wonderful. It feels good. It feels good to eat a dozen donuts. It feels good to gobble those donuts down, but it's bad for your health. Your gut is telling you that it's delicious, it's wonderful, do eat the donuts. But hopefully by now you've learned that that's a bad thing, that your gut is telling you the wrong thing in this situation. And you've learned about it because a lot of researchers have told you that this is a bad thing for your health. You will not be healthy if you eat a dozen donuts. Well, in the savannah environment, it was very important for us to eat as much sugar as possible when we came across a source of sugar, because that's how we survived. So if we came across honey, apples, bananas, whatever, had to eat as much of it as we can. We're the descendants of those who are able to do that. So no wonder that our gut response is to eat as much sugar as possible. And we have learned that this is a bad response. You have to also learn now, we have research just coming out. This is the cutting edge research showing that our gut responses of just going with our gut and our decision making are equally bad. This is a bad response, really harmful. It's the equivalent of the advice to go with your gut is the equivalent of the advice of eating a dozen donuts. And right now we're learning that this is a bad thing, that this is not a thing you should do. You should not trust your gut. You shouldn't follow your intuition. But unfortunately, it's just coming out into the public perspective. My good book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, is actually the first to talk about how to fix these gut responses, these cognitive biases. A number of books have talked about what they are. My book talks about not simply what they are, but how to fix them in business settings. And this is some of the, we are just starting to get these ideas out there. So it's very important that you don't go with those Tony Robbins who tell you to be primal, be savage, or Malcolm Gladwell who tells you to blink. You want to look at the actual cutting edge research on what will make you mentally fit, just like you're looking at the actual research on what will make you physically fit, and follow the research. Don't follow the gurus.
So in my business classes back in college, something that they really recommended was strategic planning assessments like the SWOT analysis, for example. But in your book, you write that these strategic planning tools like SWOT are actually false comforts. Why are they not appropriate anymore?
The SWOT analysis we've been finding out is actually quite problematic. Again, this is based on recent research. And it's problematic because it doesn't account for these cognitive biases. So, and this is also comes from my experience when I look at business assessment, business analysis. When you look at a SWOT analysis, what you'll probably find is that overwhelmingly, when it's done by an entrepreneur, someone who is in that leadership position, it will overwhelmingly list a lot of strengths, a lot of opportunities, and not that many weaknesses or threats, unfortunately. Because entrepreneurs, so I'm an entrepreneur. I lead a 6-people company called Disaster Avoidance Experts that does training, consulting, and coaching. And I am a very optimistic person. The vast majority of entrepreneurs like myself, leaders, they tend to be very optimistic because optimism helps you get to the top of the leadership heap, because people who are perceived as optimistic and who are optimistic, they are perceived as leaders. The alpha monkey in the room, that tends to be associated with optimism, confidence, charisma, inspiration. And I do have that. And so the people who naturally wind up in leadership positions are the ones who lead SWOT analysis. And their opinion is the one that matters. So a SWOT analysis that's done in a group often falls into groupthink, where the opinion of the people in the room coalesces around the opinion of the leader. Doesn't really lead to a good consequence, but that's what usually happens with SWOT analysis. So because of this optimism, you tend to see way too much opportunities and strengths, not nearly enough weaknesses and threats. And that, of course, leads to the strategic plan being very disbalanced, where you don't take care of a lot of risks and problems and threats, and you overinvest into your perceived strengths and opportunities, which are not nearly as strong or as good, rewarding for the opportunities as they actually are. And we, of course, see that right now with COVID-19, where a lot of potential threats from disastrous situations like COVID-19 haven't been accounted for. So companies are really in shambles. Now, what about all those airlines, for example, that have spent all of their so much of their financial resources buying back their stocks and now have to be bailed out by the government? That's not a great situation. By contrast, people who are aware of these cognitive biases, like let's say Warren Buffett, he's been sitting on a pile of cash in Berkshire Hathaway because he knows something might well happen and the market will go down, and then he will buy up smartly right now companies that are in a tough situation, like airlines, at a very cheap price. So he understands these cognitive biases, these fallacies of the human mind, and he can take advantage of them. And you should be in that same position. Don't trust the optimism to lead you to make the right decision.
Absolutely. So I love that you mentioned Warren Buffett, because Warren Buffett's known for being very principled around his decision making. But then you also hear about a lot of notable CEOs, and what the conversation and the myth around these people ends up being is that they had great instincts. So I hear things like Henry Ford had great instincts, Jack Welch and Jeff Bezos. Is this just a myth that's been fabricated? Were they actually doing very strategic method of decision making, taking into account unconscious biases.
No, Henry Ford, Jack Welch, Jeff Bezos are overwhelmingly not doing this. The myth that they went with their gut and they made the right decisions is a myth. It's a nice thing that they can promote about themselves, saying, we have magical decision-making powers. Our gut is always right, and therefore you should trust us with your money. This kind of hype is great for getting investors to part with their money. It's often bad for decision-making. So if you see someone successful, you can be confident that they might tell you that they're going with their gut, but they're actually thinking through a lot of their decisions. So for example, Bill Gates has often said that he trusts his gut. But if you look at his actual process of decision making, he's very skeptical about his thinking, and he gets a lot of information. He gets others to question him, to argue with him, to debate with him, and he does not actually go with his gut. He doesn't go with his intuition. It's a nice thing to say, and it makes people trust him more, but that's not how he actually makes his decision. Same thing for Jeff Bezos. He overwhelmingly doesn't go with his gut. I mean, in a recent speech, he told people in Amazon that, hey, Amazon will eventually fail. We just have to work very hard on delaying this failure. That's not the language of a person who goes with his gut. That's the language of a person who's diligently looking out for threats like COVID-19. And of course, Amazon is wonderfully positioned to take advantage of the situation with COVID-19. And I bet Jeff Bezos has been working for a while to make his supply chains more robust, which they pretty much are. I mean, Amazon is quite a bit less disrupted, for example, than Walmart. Walmart's technology is not as good, and its supply chains are also, it seems, not as good by comparison to Amazon, which is supplying people, making better decisions in this time of crisis than Walmart, for example.
Absolutely. And Amazon's just got so much better automation and other types of software on their side that Walmart just doesn't have those same capabilities. So what's really influencing bad decision-making is this concept that you bring up called cognitive biases. And in the staffing recruiting world, it's something we're starting to become familiar with as well because of the way it can impact hiring and diversity. But beyond that, like how far-reaching are things like normalcy bias and other types of cognitive biases in influencing business-making decisions?
They're incredibly far-reaching. So of course, in hiring and recruiting, you would be not right now hearing about cognitive biases like the halo effect and the horns effect. So this has to do very much with tribalism. The halo effect, refers to when we like one characteristic of someone, we will tend to like all of their other characteristics. And the horns effect is the opposite. When we dislike one characteristic of someone, we tend to dislike all of their other characteristics. So I'll go back to an example based on where I live right now. We talked about Ohio State, the home of the Buckeyes. So people in Ohio and central Ohio, here in Columbus, are very passionate about the Buckeyes. And our big rival is the University of Michigan Wolverines. So I was giving a closing keynote at the local HR Diversity Inclusion Conference, the annual conference of diversity inclusion here in Columbus, Ohio. And I was talking to about 100 plus, so a little bit over 100 HR experts in diversity inclusion, leaders in diversity inclusion. And I asked these Central Ohio-based folks, how many of them would hire University of Michigan fans? And of the 100 plus people in the room, only 3 said that they'd hire University of Michigan fans. So 3 people. And I have that recorded. So 3 people said that they'd hire University of Michigan fans. They're looking out for things that are legally protected, sexism, whatever, ethnicity, gender issues, LGBTQ, ability, ageism, but they're not looking out for so many other things that are actually influencing their decision-making, like which sports team you will root for. And people are really passionate about that. And this, of course, influences their hiring in very problematic ways that they're not realizing. And these are just 2 out of over 100 cognitive biases that reach into every aspect of business. So we're talking about the halo and horns effect. I'm happy to go further. So I had a consulting engagement where I was working with a real estate company that managed properties. So my property management company that does real estate property management of housing associations. And there was a central office with accounting and so on, software, IT, and local regional offices that actually interacted with clients. So local regional offices were very client-oriented. And of course, the central people were very more policy rules-oriented. So the local office, in this case, wanted to give this pretty big client, which was a 100,000 plus a year client. The client wanted something to appear different on their accounting statement, on their financial statement. And that was part of the finances and so on were managed by the real estate management company as part of managing other things. And the real estate local office went to the central office and said, hey, can you please change around this thing that it appears for the client? And the central office said, no way, Jose, this is our policy. We're not going to change around their statements. And so they started exchanging emails, and the emails got increasingly bitter and started calling each other names and using caps lock. They started CCing the CEO, and that got really out of hand. CEO told me later in a private conversation that people behave like psychopaths in email. So not good. You don't want the CEO to think that. Well, that's what happened. And that is an example of the halo effect and the horns effect, the dangerous impact of that it has for teamwork, where people within the company had horns effect toward each other. The central office, the accounting office, has long had horns effect toward local offices, which were more client oriented, and the local offices had horns effect toward the central office, which was more policy oriented. And so we had to work on how to address these things, and we were eventually able to do it using the techniques that I describe in the book. So I described this case study in the book, but that's an example of how the halo effect and the horns effect don't simply impact hiring. They impact teamwork, collaboration inside the companies. And there are over 100 of these cognitive biases, which greatly damage recruiting, of course, and also all other sorts of business activities within the company.
That's fascinating. And your book covers so many different types of cognitive biases, but which ones, if you had to pick a small list of the hundreds of them that are out there, are the most dangerous and impactful to business decision making?
Well, besides the ones that I mentioned already, the halo effect, the horns effect, normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting, I'd want to highlight status quo bias. Now, the status quo bias tends to cause us to want to maintain the status quo. It was very natural in the savannah environment because any sign of change in the savannah environment was likely to be a bad thing. We would have our lives disrupted and we couldn't really adapt to this new situation because our lives were so precarious and survival was always on the thin edge of survival. So any change in the environment was likely to be a bad thing and likely to lead to people dying. So there was a very strong disinclination to change by our ancestors, and we had that now. We have a lot of fear of new things, and we want to maintain the status quo. We don't want to lose. And so I mentioned the confirmation bias as well. That's an important one. Finally, another one that I want to talk about is called the attentional bias. Now, in the savannah environment, it was very important for us to pay attention to the most emotionally salient thing that was happening, whatever drew our emotions the most. In the modern environment, that's a bad idea because a lot of things in our background context might be very important. I mean, with COVID-19, it was not very emotionally salient what was happening in Wuhan in December of 2019 because, China, far away inland, who cares, right? Well, that's not the reality of the situation. Wuhan is a city of 10 million people, huge industrial city, and had 500 plus international flights. So people who were getting sick in Wuhan were going around the world. And we know now that the virus was circulating, COVID-19, in Washington state long before it was acknowledged here in the United States. So for a very long time by people who brought it from Wuhan. So this is an example of where we don't pay attention to the broader context, and we are very much harmed by not paying attention to things that aren't emotionally salient.
There's so many different things that a staffing leader is paying attention to every day. So how can one determine what cognitive biases they're most vulnerable to?
Well, what you need to do is learn about the cognitive biases. I mentioned there are over 100 cognitive biases. You can take a look at the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia. That's the list of over 100 cognitive biases. Now, my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, has an assessment in the end that lists the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases for recruiting and other business activities and helps you go through them to see whether you're vulnerable to them or not. So that is going to be a good tool for folks to use. You can get a free copy, digital copy of the assessment on disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And what you want to do is learn what you're most vulnerable to. So for example, for me, I mentioned optimism bias is one of my biggest weaknesses. So I know that that's a problem for me. Now, since I know that's a problem, I can take specific steps to address it. I can learn that, hey, I tend to be very optimistic. I think that the world is nice and friendly. I think the grass is green on the other side of the hill, even though it's sometimes yellow. You know, I have 100 ideas before breakfast, and I think all of them are brilliant. Not the case. They're not actually all brilliant. The world is not as nice as they think it will be. You know, people who I'm interviewing are not as good fit, and they're going to hide things in their CV and inflate and exaggerate things, right? So this is not something that's intuitive for me. And I have to learn about the specific areas where I make mistakes because I'm too optimistic, and then correct for these problems to calibrate better for making the right decision. So that's something I had to learn. And you as a recruiting leader, as a recruiting expert, have to learn that as well. What are you most vulnerable to? And again, the optimism bias is just one out of the cognitive biases to which I'm pretty prone to.
That's so funny that you mentioned optimism bias is the one you find you're prone to as well. Because I went ahead and I took the assessment, and that was one of the ones that came up for me as well. And I think it's actually quite accurate because I've been working in startup companies for most of my career. And I think almost everyone at a startup company, you have to have a bias towards optimism to even join a early stage venture. It's risky. Yeah. So, I mean, you've made like a really great case about why we need to learn about cognitive biases. But, you know, besides Wikipedia, reading your book, is there anything else that people can do to really get educated around them?
The most important thing you have to realize is you have to get your emotions invested into addressing these problems. Just learning about them, you know, I've talked about the attentional bias, the information bias, halo effect, and the Horns effect. So many of these cognitive biases, you know, you hear about them, you're not cured. It's not magical. You know, you just by learning about this problem, you will not address it, unfortunately. So just by learning about it, that's the first step that you can take to addressing it. Just like people who are aware of the things like the attentional bias, they will still not be paying attention to the things in their context. They'll still be paying attention to what's most emotionally salient until and unless they learn to appreciate and get their emotions invested by understanding the kind of damage each of these cognitive biases, especially the ones they're most vulnerable to, has caused them. So in order for me to get invested into addressing the optimism bias, I had to go back over my past experience once I learned about it, and I went, oh crap, I'm vulnerable to this. Let me see how it harmed me in my life. So I went back, I looked at all these problems, all these issues that are caused by my optimism bias, and I saw where it damages me, what causes me harm. And then once I got my emotions invested in, I thought, oh, this is really problematic. This is bad. Then that helped motivate me to take the steps needed. So this is an issue of motivation and habit building. You have to develop a new mental habit to catch yourself when you're about to fall into one of these cognitive biases. And I have to develop a mental habit to catch myself when I'm falling into the optimism bias. It's not perfect, it doesn't work always, but I'm much better than I used to be. And especially for bigger issues. So if I'm having a big idea, a big notion, big project that I want to work on, now I make sure to not simply work on it by myself, but run it by someone who's a pessimist. So one of the big problems that you'll run into in recruiting is that it'll be very tempting to recruit other people who tend to have your tendency. And it's a big problem for startups that they recruit people who are optimistically minded, because then everyone will have 100 ideas before breakfast, and everyone will think they're brilliant, and everyone will reinforce each other's ideas, and the startup will be running in 1,000 different directions, because you'll have 10 people with 100 brilliant ideas, and everyone will say, yes, all of your ideas are brilliant. That is not helpful. You need, and I have learned from my company that I need people who are pessimistic on my team. I don't like working with pessimistic people. It's not fun. It's not pleasant. I click with people who are optimistic. That's enjoyable. That's fun. It's engaging for me. But with pessimistic people, I know that I can run my 100 brilliant ideas by them, and they'll say that, these all have baked potatoes. Maybe these 3 are worth finishing baking. And then they will take a close look at those 3 ideas, and they will fix all the flaws, and they will take them to fruition because they're great at that. I am good at generating ideas. People who are pessimistic are terrible at generating ideas. It's not their strength. They see exaggerated flaws in each idea, but they're great at evaluating ideas, seeing which ones have the least flaws, and then taking them to fruition. So you want to have that collaboration and that investment. So knowing about what you're most vulnerable to, and then knowing about how to fix that problem, and being emotionally invested into doing so, creating a mental habit that would help you do so.
So in your book, you talk about this really interesting decision-making model, and it'd be great if you could explain it a bit right now, because in the book, it says it's very, very useful for overcoming dangerous judgment errors that business leaders are prone to making.
Yes, so there are two models that I talk about in my book. One is for quick decisions and one is for thorough decisions. So the thorough decisions is an 8-step decision-making model. This is for serious decisions when you're about to hire someone who is a key employee in your company, when you're about to decide on launching the next product, when you're making a big strategic plan, big pivot. Those are the kinds of things where you want to use this 8-step decision-making model. And it takes about an hour to do or so. I mean, more if you have more people. So this is a thorough process. First step, identify the need for a decision to be made. Now, this might sound simple, but it's not. At Boeing, the leadership didn't, so since we're using Boeing, at Boeing, the leadership didn't identify the need to stop and reassess the 737 MAX, even though it got a lot of signals from inside the company that there's a problem with it. So they missed the opportunity to stop and reassess and maybe delay by a few months the 737 MAX, and look at what happened to Boeing. Not only did 346 people die, but also the CEO lost his job and the company lost over $20 billion, and of course more going forward. Then you want to gather relevant information from a variety of perspectives. Don't only look for people who agree with you. This is very tempting to look for people who agree with you, but you got to find the confirmation bias and related cognitive biases and look for people who don't have your perspective. So I make sure to run my ideas by pessimists, no matter how unpleasant it is for me to hear about all the flaws of my supposedly brilliant ideas. Then you want to decide your goals, paint a vision of the outcome. So what outcome do you want to achieve? Think about what is the ideal outcome that you're going to. So let's say you're launching a new product. What is the outcome of launching a new product? You're not just launching a new product just to have fun with it. What do you want to achieve? What problem are you solving for the market? What will people be doing with the product? How are you making sure to solve their underlying pains? And especially right now in the context of COVID-19, you want to think about changing perhaps your product launch plans to address the situation with COVID-19, where people will be spending much more time at home. So be ready to pivot as needed. Then develop clear decision-making criteria to evaluate options. So when let's go into recruiting. Let's say you're making a hire. You want to think about recruiting criteria. Someone, obviously, their salary requirements, their fit in the company, their experience in this industry, perhaps their Rolodex, or, as the kids, their LinkedIn connection profiles, so their contact network, all of these things. So those might be the 4 criteria you have, and you can have, of course, more. Maybe diversity can be a 5th criteria, and many more. So then weigh them compared to each other. Let's say, you're flush with cash. Then probably the salary requirements might not be as important to you. And your team might be all made up of all of white males. That means diversity should be quite a bit more important to you. So those are the kinds of things that you want to weigh. Weigh each category, each criteria on a scale of 1 to 10. So if you're flush with cash, your salary requirements, it might be less important for the person you're hiring. So it might be at a 4. But if you were really focusing on diversity, the diversity might be at a 10. And maybe fit in the company might be at a 7. Something like that. Then generate viable options to achieve your goals. So you want to hire appropriate amount of people. You want to have at least 5 viable options. What really happens with startups very often with entrepreneurs is that they tend to go for the first viable option. First option that seems good. For a major decision, this is a really bad idea. You don't want to go for the first option that seems good, because that will not maximize the outcomes. For major decisions, you want to get as close to perfect as possible. You don't want to go for a good enough decision. There's another technique that's much quicker, much more effective for doing a quick decision to minimize risks. This is a technique for maximizing rewards as well as minimizing risks. So you want to have at least 5 viable options. So 5 viable options you can hire, let's say. Then weigh the options, picking the best of the bunch. Rank each of the 5 options, Sam, Sally, Harry, Mary, whatever. Rank all of them based on the criteria. If someone has a salary requirement that's high, rank them as high in the salary requirement. But if they are really good fit, rank them high in the fit. If they're low diversity, if they're white male, then rank them low on that. And then implement the option you chose. Here you want to make sure that, if you pick the best of the bunch, weigh them using the criteria. So if someone's low on the diversity criteria, even if they have a very low salary requirement, you know that they're not going to be a very good fit. Then implement the option you chose. So implementing, there are two steps that you want to think about here. You want to minimize failure. And that way, to minimize failure, you want to imagine what are all the ways that this hire can fail. Think about this hire failing. So you want to actually imagine this hire failing, catastrophically failing, whatever, in a year, this person is absolutely not around. Then think about why are they not around? What has caused them to fail? Maybe they didn't get sufficient mentoring. Maybe you didn't sufficiently investigate the resume and they lied a number of things. I don't know. Then that's something that you want to address in advance. Investigate the resume more, check the references and so on. Then maximize success. Imagine in a year that the outcome of the search has been much better than you thought, that you expected. This person has come up a long way and has become, I don't know, the new CEO, something like that. So wonderful outcome. Why was it success? Why was it successful? So think about the success. Can you maximize success? Maybe you want to give this person especially big support right now as they're transitioning into the company while they're in a virtual team. So how would you support them in this context? It's a very different context than you had just about a couple of months ago. Next, evaluate the implementation process and revise as needed. So for maximizing success, minimizing failure, you want to put specific metrics. So if you're having a hire, what does it mean for the person to succeed? Have their metrics for evaluation. Maybe you want to have something like other people in the team have a very positive assessment of how this person is doing. And so you want to have a specific rankings where you have this person rated by other people on the team in their early stages. And then if there's problems, you want to revise as needed. So catch problems and address them in advance rather than just having this person sink or swim. So this 8-step decision-making process takes about an hour to go through, a little bit longer if it's a more serious decision or if you're making it as part of a team, and it will help you make as good a decision as possible, as perfect as possible to make. So this is the process you should make on any serious decision.
Yeah, I love the decision-making model, and I think it's not only applicable to recruiters at staffing companies, but also managing directors and other high-level executives that are making business-wide decisions around things like adopting artificial intelligence for recruiting or enacting a digital transformation plan. But sometimes there's not always enough time to go through this very methodical 8-step model. And can you talk a bit about the quick decision-making strategy you outlined in your book for when you're really pressed in time?
So this is a decision-making strategy when you're pressed for time or when you just want to minimize problems, you don't want to maximize rewards. This is a good enough, this is a satisfying decision-making model. You ask yourself 5 questions about any decision that you don't want to screw up. 5 questions takes only a couple of minutes. Very quick, very effective. First, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence did you take into account? This addresses the confirmation bias and a lot of other related cognitive biases. You want to look for information that disconfirms your beliefs. Try to prove that you're wrong. Try to prove that you're mistaken. If you can't prove that you're mistaken, that's great. You're more likely to be correct. But if you can prove that you're mistaken, that's also great because it gives you a chance to make a better decision. That's first. Second, what dangerous judgment errors haven't I yet addressed? So what cognitive biases are at play? Of course, for a recruiting decision, you want to think about things relating to people, like the halo effect and the horns effect. For planning, you want to think about the planning fallacy, hyperbolic discounting, normalcy bias, and so on. So it depends on the situation. Third, what would a trusted and objective advisor tell me to do? So think about that angel on your shoulder. What would they tell you to do about the situation? Step outside of yourself. Think about what you would tell a close friend who you want to make the right decision here. And of course, you can just call this trusted and objective advisor, or if you're a millennial, text this person. Next, 4th question. How have I addressed all the ways that this could fail? You might remember this from the 7th step on the previous process, but this doesn't maximize success. This only addresses failure. So you want to minimize problems, minimize risk. This is not about maximizing success. Imagine that this decision completely failed and why it failed, and then address those problems in advance. Finally, what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? What would cause you to change your mind? So for example, with a recruiting process, it might cause you to revisit the decision if the people who are rating this person rate this person as not doing a very good job. So you want to revisit that. Maybe you want to give this person a lot of extra coaching, or maybe this was not the right hire and you want to change your mind. So this is the decision-making process. 5 questions, very quick, just took me a couple of minutes to talk through, and will save you hours and hours and hours of time fighting with fires by making bad decisions.
Nice. Now, as businesses are thinking about and even switching over entirely to remote working environments, which they're really not used to operating in, are there any techniques or other concepts that you can share to help them create the right plan and make the right decisions around a remote workforce?
Absolutely. So mentioned already addressing failures. There's a technique called failure proofing, an in-depth one that goes specifically into implementing a decision. So we talked about making the decision. This is more about implementation. You want to go in depth into all the reasons why a decision might fail. In order to do that, it's ideal for you to do this with a team. So get together a team of people who have stakeholders in the situation. So if you're moving to remote work, say people like the CEO, COO, the HR leader, few people who would be actually working remotely, so you get their experience, and the IT leader, of course. So you want to get them on a team and discuss, have them first imagine that whatever you're doing, that this remote work has completely failed. It's completely failed for you to take the people to remote work, and then have people generate anonymously all the reasons why it failed. Now, anonymously is really important here because of groupthink. It's very tempting to coalesce around the opinion of the leader in the room. And anonymity helps address that. So have everyone anonymously write out all the reasons why it failed, especially politically problematic ones. So, things like this failed because the CEO doesn't know how to use this technology. This is not something you want to necessarily be saying out loud, but this is something, if you have let's say if your company has a professional CEO who's an old timer, who really knows how to manage companies well, but doesn't know how to use technology well, this would be a problem. So you need to, even though it might feel uncomfortable to the CEO might need a lot more coaching and hand-holding, and other leaders in the company might as well, who are professional CEOs and are not very well familiar with Zoom and other technologies like this. So have that awareness, and then of course fix these problems, and have the same thing for success. Anonymously, imagine it succeeded, anonymously write out all the reasons for success and build those into the plan. So that technique, the going in depth into the failures and the successes as part of a team where you have everyone write out the reasons anonymously and then brainstorm solutions for both success and failure, that will help you maximize the likelihood of the decision being implemented well.
Wow. Thanks so much for hopping on this podcast with me, Dr. Gleb. I think this is one of my favorite parts about my job at Maya is doing these podcasts and just getting the chance to talk to really interesting and intelligent individuals like yourself. As we're wrapping up, are there any ways that people can connect with you further if they want to learn more about bias? Where can they purchase your new book?
So my books, of course, are available in bookstores everywhere because they're published by great traditional publishers. Unfortunately, many bookstores are closed, but still check out if you happen to have a bookstore that's not closed. The book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, published by Career Press, great traditional publisher, bookstores everywhere, Barnes Noble and so on. And the new one called The Blind Spots Between Us that's coming out. That's my new book. The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. The first one focuses on business decision making. The second one focuses on relationships. And the second one is published by New Harbinger Publishers, also a great traditional publisher. And of course, they're all available online, which I imagine most people will be ordering because of COVID-19. So on Amazon, Barnes Noble, and so on Audible, if you like audiobooks, there's physical copies, digital copies, and audiobooks available. My own resources, check them out on disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. That has videos, blogs, podcasts, decision aids, guides, manuals, online classes, virtual coaching, virtual training, and of course, various other forms of virtual activities, because that's what we're switching to nowadays. You want to especially check out disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe for, as I mentioned, it has the assessment on dangerous judgment errors and a free 8-video module class, 8 modules, free class on video-based modules on making the wisest decisions. And the assessment is part of the course. And finally, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you have any questions about what you heard here, please connect with me there and ask your questions. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky on LinkedIn, GLEB TSIPURSKY.
All right, thank you so much. And to our listeners, all those links will be available in the show notes. So if you're interested in connecting more with Dr. Tsipursky, just go ahead and click those links. And thank you so much for coming on the show again.